Hello everyone. This time next week, I will be announcing something very exciting in a podcast episode. In the meantime, I'm going to touch on a fascinating topic. This episode is something of an overview, and if you lovely people listen to it and share it, I can do a multi-part series if that's something you think would be interesting. If I was to ask you, what country was the only Western democracy to officially send condolences to Germany in 1945 on the death of Adolf Hitler, what would you say? Switzerland? Nope. Argentina? Nope. The answer, which, to be fair, you probably already guessed, is Ireland. But why? And how on earth did the Irish government keep its reputation intact after what was, to all appearances, paying homage to a man who, even in 1945, was being realised for the atrocities he apparently oversaw? Well, dear listener, it's for you to decide. Is all that overshadowed by the diplomatic duties of a nation which had only officially been in existence a little over a decade? Anyway, time to rewind. Obviously, World War II ended in 1945, but what was the stance of the Irish government regarding the war from when it began? Now, if you're Irish listening to this, it probably won't come as a surprise that the government at the time don't call the conflict World War II. Rather, they call it a name which has become the name in Ireland: the emergency. Now, we have at this point fought a war of independence and a civil war on the island of Ireland in the preceding 2 decades. So, using euphemism to avoid yet another flashback to trauma is totally understandable. Further to this, our Taoiseach, which for any non-Irish listeners is our Prime Minister, is Eamon de Valera. He had actually fought in the Easter Rising of 1916 and only avoided execution due to the fact he was, reportedly at least, born in New York. He knows firsthand what conflict is like, so he quickly and publicly declares that the newfound Republic of Ireland is taking a stance of moral neutrality with respect to the fledgling conflict. Also, it was setting a marker to London, saying essentially, we're not getting involved and we're independent, so you can't make us. But neutrality demands sacrifices. In the case of Ireland in the late 30s and early 40s, this means censorship. Frank Aiken is the man in charge, and he enforces a moral neutrality. Essentially, as far as the Irish public are concerned, the war was happening, but wasn't that bad. This is all because the government enforced rules whereby no big battles or atrocities were allowed to be published in Irish news outlets. Even the word Nazi was banned. A letter to the Irish Times even claimed that the Irish public wouldn't believe the atrocities even if the victims rose from the dead. Instead, according to this letter, people would just, and I quote, mutter British propaganda. Now, you can see a point to this, to be fair. The Irish government aren't stupid. They do not want to give the people any reasons to have their passions inflamed again by either side in this conflict, to a point where the storm clouds of war would once again potentially visit our shores. But if there's one thing to know about human nature, it's that absolute neutrality is hard, and, according to later studies, too hard. Allied air forces are allowed throughout the war to use the Donegal corridor, which means that many, usually American planes, are allowed to fly through a narrow strip of airspace over County Donegal to reach Royal Air Force bases in Northern Ireland and beyond. And then there were the pilots who crash-landed. In short, and a lot of Irish people know this in 21st century Ireland, throughout the war, any Axis pilots, that is, allies of Germany, are secretly interned or imprisoned, while any pilots of Britain or their allies are secretly sent over the border to Northern Ireland, which, as part of Britain, allows for a safe return back to the war effort. Oh, by the way, you've heard of D-Day, right? Well, Eisenhower and the other organisers could have gotten it very wrong if not for weather reports given to him from Blacksod Bay, County Mayo. In short, British and American forces are on record as saying that Ireland was more useful as a friendly, neutral force than if they were an army fighting in the war. publicly, Ireland is like a strict referee, not giving fouls to either team, but under the table, so to speak, we're giving one side, the Allied forces, the rule book. But why the obsession with neutrality? In short, the cabinet feels that if they back one side or the other, they would again be putting themselves as subordinates to a bigger power, just taking orders from London, Washington, or even Berlin. Neutrality isn't just a wartime stance, it is a declaration to the world of Irish sovereignty and independence. Then, the 30th of April, 1945. At some time after 3:30 in the afternoon, Adolf Hitler puts a gun to his head, pulls the trigger, and dies by suicide. All this happens in his Führer bunker in Berlin, Germany. Now, there are many conspiracy theories that this did not happen and he instead moved to Argentina or somewhere else. But, for the purpose of this episode, let's just stick with the official story. The dream of the Third Reich is over, and Germany, and all other European countries, start to experience the waking nightmare of what, again by official records, has happened over roughly the last 6 years. And then, the whole event on which this episode hinges, on the 2nd of May, only 2 full days after the death, Eamon de Valera and his aide, Joe Walsh, do something unprecedented. They go to Dunleary. Now, to go to Dunleary is not the unprecedented thing. Rather, it's the reason for the visit that would send shockwaves across the Western world right up to the present day. They visit a house there, but it is not just any house. It is the private house of the representative of the German state in Ireland, Dr. Edward Hempel. Once inside, de Valera and Walsh officially express state condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler, leader of Germany. Now, there is a rumour de Valera signed an actual book of condolences, but as far as historians can tell, it's basically a load of sensationalist propaganda rubbish. You might think that it was just a spur-of-the-moment visit to an old friend, as Hempel was really well respected, particularly by de Valera, as a man who didn't really like what the Nazis were doing and was almost ambassador by accident, so to speak. And reading the classified papers, it's clear that de Valera's own staff are basically thinking, what on earth is this fella at? Even Walsh, that we met earlier, literally begged de Valera not to go. He knew how bad it would look for a neutral power to commiserate with a defeated country in a war, and that it could easily be seen as siding with that country. There are many ways you could read this event, and some people have claimed that it is essentially a massive throwing the middle finger at the US ambassador, David Gray. To say Gray and the Irish government didn't get on very well would be putting it extremely mildly indeed. During the entirety of the war, Gray, and by extension the United States, had been pushing and pushing and pushing as hard as they could for Ireland to officially join the US in the war, militarily. Even in May, Gray demands Ireland hand over the German legation to the Allies in order that they could not destroy any incriminating evidence. To do that, publicly at least, would obviously be seen as the ending of Ireland's neutrality. In short, de Valera's visit to Hempel was a signal to Gray and his US colleagues that Ireland will not be bullied. Also, the President of the US had died 3 weeks before, and Eamon de Valera had gone on a similar courtesy call. To him, the visit to Hempel was no different. It is the Irish Press newspaper which breaks the news, and all hell breaks loose. Almost immediately, the press agencies around the world get hold of the news, and suddenly, little old Ireland is front page news in every country you could possibly name. All during the hangover from the horrors, so emotions are heightened. Then, on that same day, Reuters news agency makes a mistake. They claim that the Irish delegation flew the swastika at half-mast from their embassy in Lisbon. Reasonably quickly, this was investigated, and it was found that a group of German intelligence operatives had occupied the floor above the Irish embassy and lowered the flag down. But Once the benefit of doubt is lost, any rumour confirming the worst fears is just accepted as fact. Internationally, Switzerland would do a masterful sidestep. As neighbours of Germany, they have to be very careful, so they decide to claim that they had never been officially notified of the death, so therefore do not need to express condolences, and Sweden just refused to offer condolences. Spain's foreign minister manages to be secretive about his condolence, and Portugal do fly their flags at half-mast, but they had given bases in the Azores to the Allies, so pointed out this as a way of saying, don't get mad, look what we did to ye earlier. Besides, both Spain and Portugal were run by dictators during World War II, so Ireland still stands as the only democratic nation to declare official condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler, the sole target for the rage of the Allied world. By mid-May, that rage is pouring in. The New York Herald Tribune called it neutrality gone mad. The Washington Post claimed moral myopia, asking if a preoccupation with protocol had removed all emotional intelligence from Ireland. And all while reports of deaths and concentration camps are also hitting those same newspapers. After immense pressure, on the 11th of May 1945, the censorship I mentioned earlier is finally lifted, and like a dam bursting, the journalistic floodgates open. Buchenwald and Birkenau hit Irish conscience. Due to Aiken's censorship, most of the Irish public literally and genuinely cannot believe their eyes or ears. There are records of people at the time presuming that the images are of typhus outbreaks at regular prison camps, a thing that lots of Irish people are familiar with. In Kilkenny, a letter to a newspaper claimed that British forces had used famished Indian men to stage a propaganda photoshoot, but it wasn't necessarily a pro-Nazi thing, rather just the only way this person could possibly imagine something like what was portrayed in those images could be reality. In America, however, the anger was far more intense and far more personal. Many, possibly over 100,000 soldiers in the US Army were of Irish descent, with others dotted through the Canadian forces. The visit to Hempel was seen by them as a personal affront and a slap in the face, so to speak, to those in America who had lost loved ones fighting for their adopted homeland against forces spearheaded by Germany. Letters to the Irish Embassy in America had phrases such as these from James O'Callaghan, born in Donegal. I respectfully ask you to close the Irish legation. It is a standing insult to all of us. You stink. You are swine. For those people, and there are countless other examples, the insistence on protocol feels like an endorsement of absolute evil. De Valera refused to back down. On the 21st of May, he sends a letter to Robert Brennan, diplomat in Washington, claiming, I could have had a diplomatic illness, but you know I scorn that sort of thing. He calls Hempel's behaviour irreproachable and says, it is in marked contrast to Grey. That being a reference to the US ambassador that we mentioned earlier. Now, you may be wondering if De Valera was a secret Nazi sympathiser. Well, let me introduce the 1937 Constitution. Remember, this is in the middle of the war, when mass anti-Semitism is flooding Europe. At this time, he inserts into Irish statute books an official safeguard against anti-Semitism. And it isn't all one way. If you go to Israel today, well, maybe after the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is over, but hypothetically at least, you can go to a forest outside of Nazareth, planted by the Jewish Council, with a very non-Israeli name. Eamon de Valera Forest. Honestly, Google it. This is done in the 1960s, recognising his support for their community in a time of rampant prejudice. So, the Nazi sympathiser theory seems to be nonsense. In short, De Valera was sympathising on the death of a head of state, not particularly Adolf Hitler, even though in this case, that's who it was. It was his way of maintaining neutrality in that he didn't want to show favouritism by choosing to pay condolences to one side, the Americans, and not to the other, the Germans. A newly independent nation paying condolences to a head of state caused absolute outrage internationally in a way that has rippled its effects right up to the present day. Also, side note, it delayed by over a decade our entry into the United Nations, but that's a story for another day. Thanks for listening. Like this if you can. Tell me what you did and didn't like, and follow me on Instagram at Liam Blake Podcaster. And, most importantly, tell everyone about the History and Heritage Podcast. Bye!